Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I will continue on the lecture about internal migration, but I just want to give some extra information here, some announcements. In the syllabus, I added here the bonus quiz number 2 that we're going to have today. It's going to be one extra point that is going to be available from today at 4:30 p.m. until tomorrow, 12 p.m. But also today at 4:30 p.m. on Canvas, you're going to be able to see what are the correct answers to all your questions on exam 3. So I suggest you looking at those first, today starting at 4:30, and then afterwards taking the bonus quiz number 2. And so this is the second point of bonus point. And as I mentioned, we're going to have like 4 bonus points. So the other 2, I will add them into these quizzes here. So I mentioned that 2 of these quizzes will be short essay questions, as it was required by the university for this course to measure critical thinking. And then, and so for the short essay questions, I will give you more time for you to answer. And today we're going to finish the internal migration chapter, so we are a little behind. And then we're going to start the race ethnicity chapter. So we won't finish it today, of course, chapter 11. And probably we will not cover all the content from chapters 5 and 6. And so like the exam 3 covered chapter about most of the chapter about mortality, international migration, and most of the chapter about internal migration. But probably the final exam will cover just the end of internal, race, ethnicity, and then let's see how we reach those ones here. But I don't think we're going to be able to see the 2 of them together. And we finish our classes on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, and the final exam is after Thanksgiving. And of course, you don't have to come back to College Station to take it, because everything's going to be on Canvas as well, the same way as we are doing. Another thing that the university informed is that the Q-drop deadline was extended to November 30th. I think the previous was until November 11th or November 12th. So I just I just added the correct information about when the student course evaluation is going to be open. So it's going to be open on November 11th, starting at 8 a.m. and close at 11:59 p.m. on November 30th. So even people who might want to Q-drop the class, they still will be able to answer the student course evaluation. So just remember to do this. It's just important to get feedback from you. As I was talking before with people in the classroom, the overall grades on exam 3 was worse than on exam 1 and 2. And because some students wrote me right after the first attempt of exam 3, giving several different explanations of why they did wrong, instead of reopening the exam just to those students, I reopened it to all students, but exactly the same style. And I was explaining too, the way that I do is I have to create question banks in Canvas, and then Canvas selects questions from those question banks. Instead of creating a question bank for each one of the chapter, I create question banks for each one of the subtopics within the chapter. So in this case here, we have 5 of them, because we're not going to cover this topic here about internal migration in China. So within these 5, I have like 5 question banks. And then maybe for some of them I have 7 questions, for some of them I have 3, for some of them I have 4. And then I ask Canvas to select a specific amount from those. So the number, for example, if I have only 4 questions here in this one, and I ask Canvas to select 2, so the chances that students will get the same questions, or in your first and second attempt on the exam 3, you got the same questions, it's high, right? Just because I just try to divide in these subtopics, because then Canvas we don't have the issue of just randomly selecting questions just from a specific portion of the chapter. I subdivide it so Canvas selects it from more different portions of the chapter, trying to be fair with those who are following everything and studying all the material. And this one here is the distribution of our grades so far. As I mentioned, a lot of people are missing quizzes. So far, we had 16 points on quizzes. Nobody got 90%, at least 90% on the quizzes. And a lot of people are pretty much just missing, not answering the quizzes. So 60% of the people got an F out of these 16 points on quizzes. And this is the distribution exam 1 and exam 2. And this is the total amount of students that are enrolled at this moment in this course. And on exam 3, only 1.4% of students got an A. So that's pretty much just one person out of 70 got an A on exam 3. And the same person has at this moment a grade taken into account that we had 76 points. So you just have to get the total points that you have in Canvas and divide by 76, because we have 20 points here, 20, 20, and 16. We had 17 quizzes, but one of them is bonus. So that's why you have to divide by 76 to know exactly your grade. Yeah, I mean, this is not good. This is the percentage of people with an A is pretty much just one person at this time. But we're gonna have still 3 bonus points, one of them today. And you're gonna have more time to study for the final exam too after classes are done. So yeah, just keep studying, taking notes, reading the textbook, reading the course material. And the course material that I have been mentioned since the beginning of the semester, the course material is not just the slides. The course material also includes the Excel spreadsheets that I spent a lot of time explaining, a lot of different material that I covered in class. Why do you think the grades, someone asked in the chat, why do you think the grades for only exam 3 is so bad? I really don't know. I mean, maybe because the chapter about mortality and international migration were more material to cover in one exam. But as you see in the syllabus, the way that I organized exams 1, 2, 3, it was really spread out throughout the semester, so we would cover similar amount of material. I don't know if students didn't study as much. I don't know if the material, it's more difficult. Someone in the classroom was mentioned that the material on the mortality chapter itself is more difficult. And we had that Excel spreadsheet, which was an additional thing. And maybe people didn't really understand that portion. So it's an open question. What will the bonus quiz be over today? The bonus quiz today is going to cover internal migration. So that's why I'm suggesting you read the correct answers for exam 3 before taking bonus quiz 2. That's the reason that I'm suggesting you doing that. Cool? Any questions? But yeah. So after class, I'd like to talk to you about some of the questions of mine. It seemed like there were a few questions that didn't have a wrong answer. Okay, I mean, just take a look at the correct answers on exam 3, which will be available today at 4:30. And then you write me an email and we set up a time to talk on Zoom, as we have been doing throughout the whole semester. I'm preparing for a lecture that I will give tomorrow morning at 6:30 a.m. to Brazil. So today I won't be able to talk on office hours, but I will be able to start having individual office hours tomorrow. But just take a look at the correct answers. If you have more questions, I'll be glad to meet. Cool? Great. So now, the last topic that I will cover about internal migration is going to be this analysis of spatial association, which is a spatial analysis that I have been working on in a project and research project related to internal migration in the US. And this topic here about internal migration in China, I will not cover in this class. So I will not ask questions on quizzes or exams about this portion here, which is available in the slides and also in the textbook. Cool. And so just going further, we've covered the domestic migration in the US, and going to slide 58. So when one interesting tool that we have, and that's not just related to migration, it's related to any topic that you might have information that's spread through space, is that you can do analysis of spatial association. It's pretty much, you can have, if you have any socio-economic, demographic indicator, and you have that information for census tracts, or you have that information for counties, and for a bunch of these geographic units, you can do an analysis, or pretty much an analysis on the map, right? It's pretty much an analysis that you are looking at the spatial distribution of these variables. And whenever you're doing spatial analysis, a spatial association analysis, what we pretty much are recognizing is that people are not randomly distributed over space. We don't have the same percentage of wealthy people living in all different census tracts within a county. We don't have the same percentage of people with at least a college degree living across all these different census tracts in a county, or in all the counties in a state, or all in the states in the country. We know that people with specific characteristics, it can be income, it can be education, it can be age, it can be occupation, race, ethnicity, all these different characteristics, people are not randomly distributed over space. And so spatial distribution is correlated with other variables. Specific people concentrate in specific areas because maybe housing is more affordable, I don't have much money, so I choose to live in that specific neighborhood. Or in that neighborhood, there are more people like me for a series of reasons, like education, occupation, race, ethnicity. I feel more comfortable, it's more affordable for me. I move to those areas. And when you have a specific, for example, country, and you can subdivide that country into a large number of spatial areas, that provides you a lot of information that you can explore, that you can try to understand how those areas, they differ among themselves in terms of socioeconomic and demographic indicators. And if you're talking specifically about demography, for example, if you have the total fertility rate for each one of the counties in the US, or if you are able to calculate the life expectancy at birth for each one of the counties in the US, or if you're able to measure internal migration flow to each one of the counties in the US. So since there are so many counties, you're able to see all this variation and try to explore deeper these different patterns on space. And the assumption that there is a stationary stability over space is highly unrealistic. It's pretty much saying it's really unrealistic that people will be randomly distributed over space considering their socioeconomic, demographic characteristics, right? And so in order to do this analysis, we do what is called an exploratory spatial data analysis, ESDA. This is the predominant approach to assess the degree of spatial the predominant approach to assess the degree of spatial association ignores the potential structural instability. What is it saying? Some traditional measures of how to estimate, how to understand how people are distributed over the space by a series of different indicators, they did not consider that the people were not randomly distributed in this space. So these global measures, these global statistics, and the most known one is the Moranzai. Moranzai is a statistic that's one number that you assign into a whole area that's subdivided in a series of areas, and you say whether these people are randomly distributed into space. But even with this global statistic, the Moranzai, it actually ignores a potential structural instability. It ignores that people are not randomly distributed on the space. So this measure here is limited. Instead of just looking, for example, at the map of the US subdivided by counties and get just one indicator, this indicator does not have the potential to measure all these different patterns that are going on in the space. So instead of having just one number summarizing everything that's happening in that space, it's better to use another kind of statistical measure that provides a local indicator of spatial association for all these different localities. It doesn't provide kind of an average, an overview of everything, such as the Moranzai, which ignores this potential structural instability. The local indicator of spatial association, called LISA, it provides a measure for each one of the areas. And what's interesting about this local indicator of spatial associations is that it looks at that area. Let's say that we are analyzing the proportion of internal migrants living in that specific area. It looks at that area, at the proportion of internal migrants in that area, and compare to the proportion of internal migrants in the surrounding areas. For each one of the sub-national areas that you have for a specific country, for example, you estimate one statistic for each one of them, this local indicator of spatial association. And so the LISA can tell you if a specific area is surrounded by other areas that have similar level for that indicator, so that group of areas would form a local cluster, or if a specific area has completely different results of other areas surrounding it. If that's the case, an area that has, for example, high levels of internal migration surrounded by other areas with low levels, that area is going to be a spatial outlier. If an area has similar values for the indicator that we're analyzing, in my example, internal migration, as the surrounding areas, then you have a local cluster, like areas that are more similar to each other. So the good thing about LISA is that it allows for the decomposition of global indicators into the contribution of each individual area. Instead of having just one global statistic that summarizes everything and it's not able to actually see all these different patterns of distribution across space, LISA allows you to understand each one of the areas, comparing them to each one of their neighbors, okay? So just to explain, LIS allows for a classification of significant locations into spatial clusters and spatial outliers. If an area has high levels for a specific indicator, and that area is surrounded by areas with high levels, that area is going to be classified as a high area. It's an area that has high levels for that indicator, surrounded by other areas with high levels. In the other case, if we have an area with low levels for a specific indicator, surrounded by areas with low levels for that indicator, that area is going to be classified as low. And those are spatial clusters because these are a group of areas with similar values for the indicator that you're analyzing. What indicator? Whatever indicator you have for those areas. In my example here, I'm going to give internal migration, but it could be fertility, it could be mortality, it could be income, it could be proportion of white population in those areas, it could be all these different social, economic, and demographic indicators. I can have something different too. I can have an area with high levels for a specific indicator, and that area is surrounded by other areas with low levels. And the opposite, areas with low levels surrounded by areas with high levels for that indicator. In this case here, I'm saying that the specific area is different than these other areas surrounding it. So we have spatial outliers because they are different from each other. And these colors here are the traditional colors that are assigned by the software, Geoda, which is a software that's available for free in this website. And this information here that I'm giving about local spatial correlation, I got it exactly from the handbook of this software. And it provides these colors here for each one of these spatial clusters and spatial outliers. So there is a reference to high. The reference to what is high and what is low is relative to the mean of the variable. It should not be interpreted in an absolute sense. So if I have an area that has a high level for a specific indicator, and then I look at the surrounding areas of that specific spatial, the geographic unit, I look at the neighbors. I look at the average value of the neighbors and compare to the one that I'm analyzing. Right? So that's how the analysis is done. It's not in an absolute term. You are looking at the average of the surrounding areas. What are the neighbors? This software allows you to define neighbors in different ways. A simple way that I do here for this exercise is just say that areas that share the border, they are neighbors. But I could also say that neighbors are areas that are within 10 miles from the middle of that area, 20 miles, 50 miles of distance. Could be distance as well. In this case, I just look at areas that share borders. Okay? The example that I'm going to give here is to analyze the concentration of internal migrants into the areas where they move to in the United States. For this case, I got data from the 2017 American Community Survey. And the American Community Survey asked the question, I mean, we know where the person is answering the questionnaire. And we ask if the person was living in another area 1 year before. If that person was living in another area within the US 1 year before, and now it's here, that person is considered an internal migrant in the current place of residence, right? What are exactly these areas of residence as measured by the American Community Survey? The American Community Survey that I'm using here is public available data and that we can get in the IPUM's website that I already mentioned in the classroom, ipums.org. So for areas of destination, the current residence, This public available data has information on what they call the public use microdata areas. It's the lowest level of geographic aggregation. We don't have the county where the person lives, because if we had information about the county where the person lived from public available data, it would be possible to identify those people. So exactly because of confidentiality issues, what the Census Bureau does, for areas that don't have as much population, they group some of these counties. For counties that have really high, that have really big population size, they subdivide these counties in several pumas. The pumas, overall, on average, they have 100,000 people living in each one of them. So for counties that have more than 100,000 people, they are subdivided. And for counties that have less than 100,000 people, they are grouped with other neighboring counties, but within the same state, right? And when we get information from this public available data about residents 1 year before using the American Community Survey, the area of origin of previous residents also informs the PUMA of the person, the public use microdata area where the person lived exactly 1 year ago. But if right now I live in an area, a PUMA, that has, 100,000 people, but before that I lived in another area that it's really remote and doesn't have a really high, a big population, what the Census Bureau does, they group these pumas of previous residents into what they call the MIG pumas, exactly because of the same issues of confidentiality. Because if I have the puma of current residents and I have the puma of previous residents, for specific cases, I would be able to identify specific people from this public available data. So what the Census Bureau does, it groups some of these areas, some of these pumas from previous residents into MIG pumas. So how many exactly pumas we have and how many MIG pumas? So in terms of current residents, the 2017 ACS has 2,378 pumas of current residents, and previous residents, we have 1,005 MIG pumas. So these pumas are aggregated into these 1,005 MIG pumas. And what we do here for this exercise is to get the area of current residents and group it into the same 1,000 areas. So exactly to have the same area of previous residents and the area of current residents, in the current residents, we pretty much just group those ones. We group pumas of destination at the same geographic level as MIG pumas of origin. This is a strategy to homogenize areas of previous and current residents, right? So instead of subdividing the country in 2,378 areas, we are dividing it only a little more than 1,000 areas. And based on the ACS, the 2017 ACS, we have around 5% of internal migrants. Those are people who live within another PUMA or MIG PUMA 1 year before the survey. Non-migrants, around 95% of the survey, those who reside in the same MIG PUMA in the current time and 1 year ago. And international migrants are around only 0.5%. Those are people who lived in another country 1 year ago and now live somewhere else in the US. Internal migrants, here in this case, I'm not talking about people who were born in another country. I'm just talking about people who were in another country 1 year ago. Even US-born people can be international migrants in this classification that I'm making. For this specific exercise, I'm not looking at these guys here. I'm taking them out of my sample, and I'm just looking at these ones, which actually are almost 100% of my cases. So I'm comparing the spatial distribution of internal migrants to the spatial distribution of non-migrants. And just to show you, this is the these are the 105 MIG pumas in the US. So we have 1,005 MIG pumas in the US that we grouped those 2,300 pumas. And this map here is pretty much just showing the proportion of internal migrants based on data from the 2017 American Community Survey. And I'm subdividing it in these 4 groups, quantile groups, in which I have exactly 245 areas in the first group here that goes from 1.5% to 4.4% of internal migrants, 246 areas here, 246 and 245. So the quantiles subdivide these 4 groups in a way that you have the same amount of areas in each one of them. But of course, in the east of the US, these areas are smaller in size, and in west they are bigger in size exactly because you have smaller populations. But here, for example, these areas with the highest proportion of internal migrants, it goes from 7.1% to 18.4%. And the one with the lowest goes from 1.5% to 4.4%. The problem is that this analysis here is really difficult to understand. It's so messy. There are 1,005 areas in this map here, and each one of them have a different classification. They are not randomly distributed, but it's hard for us to see any pattern. So what the local indicator of spatial association does, it takes into account this variable here, and then compare, for example here, this area seems to have a little higher migration, proportion of internal migrants, comparing to the areas surrounding it, to the neighboring areas. But is this statistically significant or not? And when you look here, you see that it is statistically significant. Sorry. This one has low, surrounded by high. This one has low levels of internal migration, surrounded by high. And in this case here, this area is classified as a low, This area here is classified as low because it has low levels of internal migration surrounded by areas with low levels of internal migration. So this is a cluster, a spatial cluster, in which this area has low levels of internal migrants proportionally surrounded by areas with low levels, right? And it does that for every single area. Let's see, for example, this one here. This area here has high level of internal migrants proportionally, and overall it's surrounded by areas with high levels of internal migrants. So this area here, it's an example of a spatial cluster, a high, which means that this area has high levels of internal migration surrounded by areas with high levels. Not all the areas are classified as being statistically significant. Each one of them is classified by taking into account their specific neighbors. This other area here, for example, in Nevada, has really low level of internal migration, but is surrounded by areas has high levels of internal migration. So this area here is classified as being low-high. It's a spatial outlier. It has low levels of internal migrants surrounded by areas that have high levels of internal migrants. So it does that for every single one of them. And then it summarizes this map into this one here. The red one are areas with high levels of internal migration surrounded by high levels of internal migration. Dark blue, low levels surrounded by low levels of internal migration. Light blue, low levels surrounded by high. And the pink, high levels surrounded by low, okay? For example, this area here has high level compared to these ones here that have low level. So that's why this area is pink. And then you see that overall, internal migrants in the US have low levels in these dark blue areas and high levels in these red areas. And then you see that Texas is a really clear case that's gaining a lot of internal migrants, but not as many in close to the southern border of people moving to that place from all the areas in the US. This is not international migration. We are talking just about internal.
That's why it's more of the Rio Grande Valley because more international migration versus internal migration.
Yeah, I did not analyze here international migration, but probably it's going to have higher proportions of international migration. But in this case here, just looking at people who live there now and were in other places in the US. And it doesn't attract many people from other places in the US, but you're probably correct. This area attracts more people from Mexico and from other Latin American countries, right? But trying to go deeper, following your logic, would be interesting to break down these internal migrants in a bunch of different subgroups so we can try to better understand where they are. The census, the American Community Survey, has so many questions, so I selected a few of them, which based on the literature is associated with levels of internal migration in the country. So the first analysis is to break it down by non-migrants and internal migrants. So on the left side here we have non-migrants, on the right side we have internal. And here we have those people that did not move within the US and were born in the US, moved within the US, were born in the US. And these people are non-migrants, born in another country, and moved within the US and were born in another country. So these people here, they were born in another country, came to the US, were in a specific area, and then between 2016 and 17 moved within the US. That's what these people are. So they are both international and internal. These ones here are international, but not internal migrants between 2016 and 17. They could have moved other times before that, but not in between those 2 years. Internal migrants, again, are those who changed residence between 2016 and 17. And in the case of like internal migrants who are US born, you see that these patterns here are really similar to the previous map, to these ones here. Because most of the internal migrants in the US are US born. So this, the pattern of this map here is similar to this one. And for each one of the maps in the next slide, I'm not showing the original distribution. I'm already showing only the Lisa distribution, already the summary, right? For US-born non-migrants, that's really interesting. You see that like in these Midwest and Southern areas, you have a lot of people that were born in the US and did not migrate within the US between 2016 and 17. And that's an interesting information because these people, like these areas here, were really affected, for example, by the 2008 economic recession. There are a lot of issues of unemployment and so on, but still people tend to stay in those areas. So these are areas with high levels of non-migrants born in the US, non-internal migrants born in the US, all these areas in red. And the areas in blue are areas that usually have lower proportions of non-internal migrants born in the US. And then we go a little bit to the topic that Patrick asked. Look at this one here, the non-migrants foreign born. These are people who came from another country, entered the US, and did not move within the US between 2016 and 17. And most of them are concentrated in California, in Texas, and in Florida, exactly the areas that usually receive more Latin American immigrants, right? And all these areas here have really low chances of having people born in other countries who did not migrate between 2016 and 17, compared to their surrounding areas. So it's all relative, right? What about people who were born in another country, came to the US, and then between 2016 and 17 moved again within the US? They usually go again to California, Texas, and also some areas in the Northeast and Florida, and also in the Northwest as well. But low levels in all these areas in dark blue. Now I'm going to break the internal migrants by race ethnicity. For all these maps below, we are just talking about internal migrants. I'm not talking about non-migrants anymore. Non-internal migrants are not included here. So these are all internal migrants. Those that moved between 2016 and 2017 within the US and are non-Hispanic whites. They have higher concentration exactly in those areas in dark red, and lower concentrations in Texas, California, in these southern areas. And also lower concentration around New York City as well. The non-Hispanic African-American internal migrants, it's really, really interesting to me as well, because they have higher chances of moving within the US and going to the southern areas. But you have all these other regions in the US that they have really low chances of migrating. So it's pretty much a huge portion of the US that they have lower chances of migrating internally between 2016 and 17. What about the Hispanic population? And the Hispanic population here, I'm not talking about nativity. So I don't know if they are foreign born or not in this map. I'm just looking at the Hispanics who migrated within the US between 2016 and 17. What are their chances of coming to these areas around the southern border? Really, really high. They have really high chance of being concentrated here. So going back to that first map, the first map that we saw low proportions of internal migrants here. But this is the overall. And this pattern is similar to the US-born internal migrants, the same blue we see here. When we break it by race ethnicity, then we see that those areas, the Hispanic population tends to move into those areas within the US. Again, these Hispanics here, not necessarily are foreign born. And the non-Hispanic Native Americans, they tend to go to exactly states in which there are more reservations for Native Americans. So they tend to go to those areas that are highlighted in red, and lower chances to go into those areas in blue. And the same thing about the Hispanics, lower chance to go into these southern areas here in Midwest, or exactly here as well, with where you see these blue areas. So this is pretty much just getting the proportion of internal migrants and then non-migrants, and showing it by nativity, where the people are born in the US or outside, and then by race ethnicity. We can do this for a bunch of different years, several other years, and we can also do this for several other characteristics of these people that are collected in the ACS. So just to show, this is one exercise, and a lot more can be done, and it's just really interesting to see these different patterns. So the Hispanic internal migrants do not have the same chance of migrating within the US to the same areas. The same thing about Native Americans, African Americans, and whites, right? They are not randomly distributed. That's why it's interesting to analyze this with the local indicator of spatial association. If you got the Moranzai, you just have one number to summarize everything here, and it would not give you this visual information about the distribution of these specific internal migrants across these 1,005 areas in the US. Cool? Questions? So now I will start on the chapter about race ethnicity. So as I mentioned, we're not covering that portion about internal migration in China. And here, this chapter is subdivided into why do demographers care about the race ethnicity? Why do we study race ethnicity within demography? And then I will talk a little bit about a brief history of the race and ethnic categories, how race ethnicity were measured in the US censuses over time, and then show some patterns of race and ethnicity in the US, and talk about these other additional papers that's beyond the textbook about cultural adaptation of immigrants or cultural adaptation by race ethnicity in the US, and also talking about a little bit of migration as well. Talking about the issue of Black hypersegregation in specific areas in the US. And this this last topic here, inequality of opportunity, is something that I already mentioned to you. It's a project based at Harvard, in which they try to compare how is the life of people when they are adults to how their life, the levels of earnings were of their parents when they were children. So it's pretty much just looking at intergenerational mobility. The people who were raised by parents that were more better off later in life, they continue better off. Those that were raised in poverty, do they have higher chance of continuing poverty? And what this analysis shows is that these patterns vary a lot by race ethnicity in the country. And there is a website that I will show to you afterwards, but I think I already showed in this semester, called opportunityinsights.org, that has a lot of data and information that you can collect by yourself, and I collect some of their graphs from that specific website as well. So why do we care about race and ethnicity in demography? Different race ethnicity groups have different levels of fertility, mortality, and migration rates. We saw the Hispanic health paradox, in which Hispanics have lower death rates than non-Hispanic whites, Blacks, and Native Americans. We also know that Hispanics have higher birth rates than these other groups, but more recently, their birth rates have been more similar to these other race ethnicity groups. Hispanics and Asians have higher international migration rates than non-Hispanic whites, Blacks, and Native Americans. And Hispanics have higher internal migration rates than other groups. So we see that overall in the country, we have more internal migrants who are US born and also non-Hispanic white. But when you look proportionally for each one of these race ethnicity groups, Hispanics have high levels of internal migration than other groups. So it's pretty much showing that fertility, mortality, international migration, and internal migration vary in the US by race ethnicity. That's why it's important for us to understand these different patterns. Okay? And here I'm just going to give you an overview of how the questions about race ethnicity were developed, they were first created, and how they were asked in the US censuses. The concepts of race and ethnicity are often used interchangeably by demographers, but they are two different terms. Race is associated more with physical characteristics, and ethnicity is related more to behavior or cultural attributes. But the way that we deal with this information, we usually get the information that the person self-identifies the race and ethnicity, and we combine these two, right? But race, ethnicity are different characteristics, but for these purposes, usually we do this analysis by combining them two. So the US Census and the American Community Survey contain two questions dealing with race and ethnicity. One question asks whether the person is of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. So that's the ethnicity question. And the second question asks about the person's race. And what we do is to combine these two questions. And this classification of people by race, ethnicity, it has, researchers have been working on this kind of classification for a while. So Carl Linnaeus, he was a Swedish scientist, and he is recognized as the father of taxonomy, which is the branch of science concerned with classification. And in the first edition of his System of Nature in 1735, he offered the first systematic and convincing classification of human variation. And it focused on this human variation by skin color as the most important characteristic of people. At that time, they used the terms, the colors were classified as being reddish, sallow, black, and white. And they represented the reddish, the Americanos, American Indian, sallow, Asiaticos, black, Africanus, and white, Europeans. So you have these four categories here that kind of resembles a little bit with what we have now. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit now about this. So Johann Blumenbach, he added a fifth category, the brown category, to the previous four categories proposed by Linnaeus. So Blumenbach, he suggested Caucasian, Mongolian, Malay for brown, American Indian, and Negro Ethiopian. So the Caucasian is exactly the white here. Mongolian, the sallow, American Indian, the reddish, and the Ethiopian, the black. And he is adding the brown category. What's interesting is that this category has been there for several centuries already and has influenced how pretty much the Western science and culture categorize its population by race ethnicity. So it created a familiar color-denominated racial pentagon: white, yellow, brown, red, and black. For example, in the Brazilian census, we have a question. We don't have two questions, one about race and one about ethnicity. We have one question called color/race. In that question, we actually have the category white. We do have the category yellow, brown, indigenous for red, and black. This is just to show that the similar classification that we have in Brazil, we have here in the US. What's interesting is that usually when you talk with researchers about race ethnicity in different countries, they say, oh, this country here has specificity, so we have to take that into account. But overall, these forms of classification that remain kind of constant over time, they are similar. Of course, what like researchers have been saying is that we should not just ask the person to self-identify the person's specific race ethnicity. We should show some pictures and ask the person which one of those pictures most resemble him or her. We could have a scale of colors and ask the person where that person classifies him or herself. There are different propositions in order to capture the information about race ethnicity, but the self-identification using these 5 categories still exists today. We have been talking about non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic Asian for yellow, Hispanic for brown, non-Hispanic non-Hispanic Native American for red, and non-Hispanic African American for black. The same categories that we have been talking throughout this whole semester. So race has been part of every census in the US since the first census conducted in 1790. There have been a lot of changes in the statistical categorization of race and ethnicity in the US since the first census. Despite all these changes, we are still using similar racial categories that were first developed back in 1776. Like I mentioned, Hispanics, non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic blacks, non-Hispanic Asians, and non-Hispanic Native Americans, representing exactly the same color groups: brown, white, black, yellow, and red, right? Using the same kind of classification, but using different terms. In the 1790 American Census, the first census in the US, assistant marshals listed the name of each head of the household and the number of persons in each household of the following descriptions. So each one, these assistant marshals went to the households in all these different areas in the US and counted within those households how many people were free white males of 17 years or more to assess the country's industrial and military potential. How many people in that household were free white males under 16 years of age? How many were free white females? All other free persons, and how many slaves in the household? So these numbers here is pretty much counting for the first time the American population, taking into account information about race, age, and also sex, right? And this is the result of the census from the 1790 census. You have here all these different states and areas in the US at that time. And here you have the free white males of 16 years and higher, including the heads of the families. These are the number of them. Free white males under 15 years of age. Free white females, including heads of families here. All other free persons and slaves. So the population at that time was counted in 3.8 million people, right? This is the result of that classification. And it was like this 3/5 compromise you might have heard before from history classes. It was reached among state delegates during the 1787 US Constitutional Convention. It ruled how to count slaves to determine a state's population for legislative and taxing purposes. The population size would be used to determine the number of seats that the state would have in the US House of Representatives for the next 10 years. The reason in the Constitution of why we have the census in the US is exactly to count how many people you have in these different states, so we will know how many US representatives each one of these states will have in the capital. And the 3/5 compromise pretty much counted 3 out of 5, every 5 slaves as a person. So it pretty much gave southern areas 1/3 more seats in Congress and 1/3 more electoral votes than if slaves had been ignored. And it gave fewer representations if all slaves and free people had been counted equally. So this allowed slaveholder interests to dominate the US government until 1861. So all these ways that we count people in the US and how that's going to be important to know the number of seats that each state is going to have in the US House of Representatives, it's part of the American history and has been here even today. We talk about this in the chapter about sources of demographic information, showing that exactly because the Constitution requires counting people in order to have this representation estimated, we usually have problems of gerrymandering in the country. Some congressional districts are drawn in a way that you have fewer representations of African Americans and the Hispanic population in the House of Representatives. So all these political reasons of why we count people in the US has been here forever, right? Since the Constitution Convention in 1787. And these are some variations of the categories of race ethnicity between 1850 and the 1950 American Census. So in 1850, you added this category black mulatto. 1870, you counted specifically people from China or from India. 1890, you added these other categories here on the black and mulatto, added Japanese on the Chinese. So you added other in 1910, Mexican in 1930, and American Indian, the term American Indian in 1950. So you have all this variation in how to measure, how to count people by race ethnicity. And it still changes happen. In 1970, the Hispanic origin question was added. In 1980, the ancestry question, asking where your family is from, not necessarily from a specific country, but how do you define that ancestry question is more subjective, but it was added in the 1980 census. The 1990 added information about Asian and Pacific Islander groups and other Asian category. The 2000 census allowed to mark one or more races. And this is all this information I got it from this article at the Pew Research Center. So I got these different portions of information of these changes over time from different sources. This specific one here, I got from the Pew Research Center. What are the current federal standards to measure race ethnicity? It's under the 1997 revisions to the standards for the classification of federal data on race and ethnicity. The standard has these 5 minimum categories for data on race. So you have one question for race, and you ask whether the person self-classifies as being American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islanders, and white. Sometimes you see some acronyms, AI, AN, but so these are the 5 categories under race. And then you have the second question, as we mentioned before, for ethnicity, whether the person self-classifies as being Hispanic or Latino, or not Hispanic or not Latino. And the Census Bureau spent several years between the 2010 and the 2020 census studying how to improve the data collection on race and ethnicity, trying to collect it more accurate. And why were they thinking about changing the way that we collect data on race ethnicity? They were thinking that would be more interesting to combine the 2 questions about race and ethnicity. So Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish would be an option for race and ethnicity. It would be just one question. And why that? Why Hispanic, Latino, and Spanish would become an option within one single question for race and ethnicity? Because many Latinos have left race blank or choose some other race based on data that the US Census Bureau has been collected. Some other race was the third largest group in the 2000 and 2010 census. So instead of allowing people to say some other race, in the race question, then ask race ethnicity, they were just planning to combine and then have the Hispanic, Latino, Spanish as an option. And they were mentioning that also, they were thinking that it would be good to include a category for Middle Eastern and North African separated from white, because this group has been increasing in the US because of immigration and past generations as well. So it'd be important to have this classification in the census in order to understand their process of integration and civic participation in the country. And this information here I got from the Census Bureau and also from NPR. So the US Census tested a bunch of different versions of the questionnaire. One that had the two separated questions for race ethnicity, as we had before, combined and with writing errors that we would write our race and ethnicity, combined but with check boxes and also writing, without the Middle Eastern and North African, with Middle Eastern and North African for all of them. And here, with the old instruction, mark one or more categories, and another one that in the instruction would say mark all that apply. Mark one or more, mark all that apply. Because just the way that you ask people to answer, they might answer in a different way. So they tested everything, all these combinations. Another way, in terms of the Hispanic, the ethnicity question, in this case here, they use the term origin, ethnicity, or categories. So they tested all these different ways to ask about ethnicity, Hispanic ethnicity, as what's your origin, ethnicity, or categories. So each one of these squares here in the bottom is one version of the questionnaire that was tested by the US Census Bureau. And these two here that are highlighted in blue, I'm going to show the examples of them in the next slide of these questionnaires. This one separated, non-Middle Eastern and North African, mark one or more, origin term. This one combined plus six check boxes in writing with the MENA category, mark all that apply, and the term ethnicity. So that's exactly this one here. In this case, you have separated ethnicity here and race. The term that's being used for ethnicity here is origin, exactly this one, origin. Separated, as I mentioned here, there is no MENA category. It's only white, African American, American Indian, all the different subgroups of Asian, and some other race. For this one here, they are combined. It's just one question. And the term is ethnicity instead of origin. So ethnicity here instead of origin. Or in this one was mark one or more. Mark one or more boxes. Mark one or more boxes. For this one is mark all that apply. Mark all boxes that apply. Ethnicity. And then the Hispanic Latino or Spanish became one category within this race ethnicity. And it includes the MENA, Middle Eastern or North African, right? So what the Census Bureau spent a lot of time, spent a lot of public money in order to test all these different versions of the questionnaire for all these years between the 2010 and the 2020 census. And they came to the conclusion that it would be better to change from this format here to this format here. Because a lot of people who self-classify as being from Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin, they write they self-classify as being from some other race. They don't classify any of those. as I mentioned here before, right? And that the current version doesn't have the Middle Eastern and North African, and this one adds it. But then the current federal administration pretty much ignored these studies and said, no, we will continue with a separate question for race and ethnicity, and we will not add the category for Middle Eastern or North African. So ignored all the studies that the Census Bureau did. And this was right before, like in 2018, early 2018, when they were still planning the 2020 census. This is a newsletter from the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau will not include a combined question format for collecting Hispanic origin and race, or a separated Middle Eastern and North African category on the census form, right? So just to show that this debate is still going on, and because of the current administration, and it was exactly at the time that they were planning that, right? So we don't know what might happen before the 2030 census, depending on who is going to be at that time by 2028 in power, right? So there are different ways to measure race ethnicity for populations. There are subjective and objective questions. Subjective questions are exactly the ones that we usually collect in terms of race and Hispanic origin. It's like self-reported. And some people might see themselves as Hispanic, but even having the same background, and other people might not, for all the other categories as well. The ancestry or ethnic origin in the American Community Survey is really subjective, because it's not even asking from a specific country that your parents were from, but it's a more open question about ancestry. Some other objective measures that we have in other surveys. The current population survey asks exactly the country of birth of parents, both the father and the mother. I'm doing a research project using data from the current population survey, focusing on native Nigerian Americans. So these are people who were born in the US, but their parents, either the mother or the father, were born in Nigeria. Why exactly Nigerians? Because usually Nigerians, they have really high levels of self-selection, usually really well educated, and people with really high levels of income migrate from Nigeria to the US proportionally, and then their children who are born in the US usually have really high levels of education and income, even compared to the non-Hispanic white population. And that analysis is possible to be done just with the current population survey, because it asks exactly the country of birth of parents. So we can know if a specific person who was born in the US is a second-generation immigrant, if that person is born in the US, but parents born outside. You cannot do this with the American Community Survey, because we don't have this question in the American Community Survey. Other measures that some surveys also have: what's the language used at home, and what's the English competence of each one of the people in the household. And these questions here usually appear in other surveys, but it's not really common in these major US Census Bureau surveys. Most Americans tend to simplify their origins and report a single identity. Identities associated with physical appearance are more difficult to leave out than language or culture, right? So that's, you have a lot of studies that try to explain or understand better ways to measure race ethnicity. So that's what I was saying. We have now this self-report information of these two questions that remain the same, race and ethnicity. And there are researchers doing, like Dr. Campbell in the Department of Sociology. She has several different projects trying to use other strategies for people to report their race ethnicity. Like I said, showing them pictures of people, showing them scale of colors, and kind of like trying to see what are the different way that same people answer about their race ethnicities depending on the questions that they are asked. Well, so just I I will continue. So we stopped here on brief history of race and ethnic categories. I will continue on these topics. This inequality of opportunities topic here, it's, let me just show you in the course website under the race ethnicity here, study about race and economic opportunity in the US, and the New York Times article about race and economic opportunity. These two topics here are related to that last portion, the income, the inequality of opportunity. This one here is the Opportunity Insights portal that I mentioned, based in Harvard, and Raj Chetty is the economist who coordinates this project. And there is a lot of resources here, slides, papers, data, and everything. And this New York Times article here kind of summarizes some of the findings from this research project. And the New York Times sometimes have these really cool animated graphs that make it easy for us to understand. In this case, people who grow up rich, what are the chances to continue to be rich or being poor later in life? And they are pretty much showing that Black men have higher chances of become poor even if they were rich before. And you can look at this, all this information here. I got some of these graphs and I put in our slides, okay? So thank you very much. I suggest you looking at exam 3 to see the correct answers before you take bonus quiz number 2. Both of them are open already on campus. Thank you very much, and I see you guys on Thursday.